I never thought I'd be the kind of woman to betray the vows I once held so sacred. Never. I used to look at women like that with disgust. With judgment. How could she? I'd think. How could anyone throw away something so precious? But loneliness, it changes you. It starts as a dull ache, an emptiness you tell yourself is normal. Then one day, it's swallowing you whole. It consumes you. And sometimes, it makes you do the unthinkable. I remember the exact moment I knew I was alone. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't loud. It was quiet. Too quiet. I made dinner that night, his favorite. Set the table. Lit a candle. Even put on perfume, hoping he'd notice. Hoping something, anything, would feel different. He walked in. Barely looked at me. Didn't lift his head from his phone. Just muttered, "Hey," and sat down. Scroll. 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 I sat across from him, waiting. I tried to talk. He grunted, I still glued to the screen. And suddenly, it hit me. I could have been anyone sitting there. I could have been a ghost. A shadow. A stranger. That's what I was to him. And when the person who used to make your heart race barely acknowledges you, when you live in a house with someone who no longer sees you, you start to feel like you don't exist at all. This is how it happened. How I found myself in an affair I never saw coming. How one moment, one touch, shattered everything I thought I knew about myself. And how, when it finally happened, I begged him never to stop. I know how this sounds. But if you've ever felt unseen, if you've ever been so starved for affection that just the warmth of someone's gaze felt like oxygen, then maybe you'll understand. If you've ever felt neglected in your relationship, if you've ever had desires you couldn't control, stay with me until the end. And make sure to subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga for more real-life stories that will leave you speechless. I have been married to Mark for 15 years. 15 years of memories, of routines, of moments that once felt like forever, but now barely feel like anything at all. It wasn't always like this. There was a time when he couldn't keep his hands off me. A time when his eyes would light up just at the sight of me. A time when I felt like I was the center of his world. But time does things to love. It stretches it thin, wears it down, makes it something you don't recognize anymore. I kept telling myself it was just a phase. That life got busy, that work was stressful, that the silence between us was normal. But deep down, I knew. This wasn't just a phase. This was what we had become. Mark works late now. Or at least, that's what he tells me. Sometimes I wonder if he's just avoiding me. If he stays out longer so he doesn't have to come home to this, to me. He walks through the door and barely acknowledges me. A quick nod, a muttered hey, and then he disappears into his office or onto the couch, phone in hand, scrolling endlessly through whatever is more interesting than his own wife. I still try. Every night I set the table for two. Every night I wait. And every night I eat alone. His plate untouched, my heart growing heavier with every bite. I go to bed before him now. I used to wait up, used to hope he'd come in and pull me close, but I got tired of pretending. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the cold side of the mattress beside me. He climbs in hours later, turns his back to me, and falls asleep without a word. Some nights, I think about waking him up. Just rolling over, placing a hand on his chest, whispering his name. But I don't. Because deep down, I already know how he'll react. A sigh. A shift away. Maybe even a half-hearted, not tonight. And that rejection? That's worse than silence. The worst part isn't even the loneliness. It's the fact that I don't remember the last time I felt desired. Truly desired. Not out of obligation. Not out of routine. But because someone couldn't help themselves. Because someone wanted me in a way that made me forget my own name. And then, there was Jason. I hadn't seen him in years. Not since before I got married. He was an old friend, someone who used to make me laugh in a way that felt effortless. Back then, I never thought of him as anything more than that. But time changes people. And when I saw him again, he wasn't just Jason. He was a possibility. It happened at the grocery store, of all places. I was reaching for something on the top shelf, struggling to stretch just a little further, when a hand grabbed it before I could. I turned to thank whoever it was, and then I saw him. The smile came first, warm, familiar. His eyes scanned my face, and I saw the recognition settle in. "Sarah?" he asked, like he couldn't believe it. I felt it then. The way my stomach flipped. The way my skin burned under his gaze. We talked. Just small talk at first. How life had been, where we were now. I laughed, a real laugh, one I hadn't heard from myself in so long that it felt foreign. He made a joke about how I still had that same little crinkle by my eyes when I smiled, and for a moment, I forgot everything else. Then, the question that changed everything. "Are you happy?" I should have lied. I should have forced a smile and said yes. That's what a good wife would do. That's what someone who still believed in their marriage would do. But I didn't. I hesitated. And in that hesitation, I knew. And so did he. He didn't push. He just nodded, like he understood. Like he saw me in a way no one had in years. We exchanged numbers. It felt innocent enough. An old friend, reconnecting. Nothing more. At least, that's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew better. I knew it the first time I picked up my phone, my heart racing at the sight of his name. I knew it when I found myself checking my messages more than usual, waiting for him to text back. And when he did, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Seen. Wanted. Alive. I wish I could say that was the moment I stopped. That I deleted his number, ignored the pull I felt toward him, went back to my cold, distant marriage and tried harder. But I didn't. Because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't just someone's wife. I was a woman. And I was starving. The first message was simple. "It was really nice seeing you today, Sarah. You haven't changed a bit." I stared at my phone longer than I should have. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, mind racing. Was I overthinking this? It was just a text. A polite follow-up to an unexpected meeting. I could ignore it. I could delete it. I could pretend nothing inside me had shifted. But instead, I replied, "It was nice seeing you too, Jason. It's been so long." That was how it started. One message, then another, and another. At first, the conversation stayed light, safe. We talked about work, about old memories, about how fast time had passed. But there was something under the surface. A weight behind every word. I could feel it even through the screen. And the worst part? I liked it. The texts became more frequent. At night, I would wait for them. In the morning, they were the first thing I checked. I found myself laughing at my phone, smiling without meaning to. For the first time in years, I felt interesting. Like I was someone worth listening to. Like I wasn't just a wife, a mother, a shadow moving through the motions of life. Then came the first invitation. "Let's grab coffee sometime." Just to catch up. No pressure. I hesitated. I should have said no. I should have made an excuse, shut the door before it ever had a chance to open. But I didn't. I told myself it was innocent. Two old friends having coffee. Nothing more. The cafe was quiet, tucked away from the main street. A place I had never been before, far from anywhere Mark might happen to be. A small precaution I hadn't even realized I was taking. When I walked in, Jason was already there, waiting. The way his eyes lit up when he saw me, it did something to me. He stood, pulled out my chair. A simple gesture, one Mark hadn't done in years. I sat down, suddenly aware of every movement, every glance. And then we talked. But this time, it was different. He asked questions that no one had asked me in years. Not just about my life, but about me. My thoughts, my dreams, my regrets. I found myself telling him things I hadn't admitted to myself. And then, the words that changed everything. "Are you happy, Sarah?" I could have lied. I should have lied. But instead, my voice came out barely above a whisper. "I don't know." The look in his eyes told me he already knew the answer. That coffee shop became ours. What started as an occasional meetup turned into something more. More frequent. More intense. The space between us at the table grew smaller. The silences between our words stretched longer, filled with something unspoken, something dangerous. I told myself it was harmless. Just talking. Just a friendship. But late at night, when I lay in bed next to my husband, scrolling through my phone, rereading our conversations, my heart pounding at every message, I knew better. I started dressing differently, fixing my hair before our meetings, checking my reflection twice before I walked out the door. It wasn't for Mark. It wasn't for me. It was for Jason. Then, one afternoon, after a long conversation over coffee, he reached across the table and brushed his fingers against mine. Just for a second. But in that second, something inside me cracked wide open. I didn't pull away. And I knew. This wasn't just talking anymore. This was the beginning of something I wasn't sure I could stop. I started sleeping with my phone under my pillow. Not because I was hiding anything. Not yet. But because the thought of missing a message from Jason felt unbearable. Every night, after Mark rolled over and drifted into sleep without a word, I would turn my phone on silent and stare at the screen, waiting. And when his name appeared, my pulse would quicken, my stomach twisting with something I refused to name. I told myself it was just excitement, just the thrill of reconnecting with an old friend. But I knew better. Jason made me feel something I hadn't felt in years. He saw me. Mark barely looked at me anymore. I could walk into the room in a dress I used to wear on our date nights, hair done, perfume lingering in the air, and he wouldn't even glance up. But Jason noticed everything. You changed your hair, didn't you? It looks beautiful. You have that little line between your brows again. What's on your mind? Small things. Simple things. But they chipped away at the walls I had built around my heart. And then, one day, I almost told Mark the truth. It was late. We were in the kitchen, barely speaking as we moved around each other. I had been quiet all day, lost in my own thoughts, battling the war inside me. I turned to him, my voice unsteady. Are you happy? He barely glanced at me. What? Are you happy? With us? With this marriage? He sighed. Rubbed his eyes. Sarah, I'm exhausted. Can we not do this right now? And just like that, the moment passed. The words I had been holding on to slipped away, swallowed by the silence that had become our normal. That was the night I stopped fighting it. I had been holding on for so long, telling myself that things would get better. That Mark would wake up one day and realize how distant we'd become. That he'd reach for me, touch me, want me again. But I was done waiting. I deserved to be wanted. I deserved to feel loved. Jason remembered things about me that Mark had long forgotten. The way I took my coffee. My favorite song from when we were younger. The book I said I wanted to read but never got around to. He listened. He cared. And when our messages turned from casual to something deeper, I didn't stop them. I let myself fall. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone. The night it happened, I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong. Jason had asked if I wanted to meet him for a late coffee. Just coffee. Just another conversation. We'd done this before. But something felt different this time. Maybe it was the way his voice had sounded when he asked. Maybe it was the way I had hesitated before answering, the way I had checked the time and realized Mark wouldn't even notice if I stayed out a little longer. I said yes. It was raining when I pulled into the parking lot. The cafe we usually went to was closing early, so Jason texted me an address to a small bar a few streets away. It was dimly lit, nearly empty, the kind of place where no one would recognize me. He was already there, waiting. He stood when I walked in, smiled at me in that way that made my breath catch. I sat down across from him, and for a moment, we were just us again. Talking, laughing, the way we always did. But the air between us had changed. I felt it every time his eyes lingered on my lips. Every time his fingers brushed against mine when we reached for our drinks at the same time. I knew I should have left. I knew I was playing with something dangerous. But I didn't move. I let myself enjoy it. The warmth of his attention. The way he listened to every word I said, as if nothing else in the world mattered. And then, at some point, the space between us disappeared. I don't even remember how it happened. 1 second, we were talking. The next, I felt the heat of his body beside me. He reached for my hand. I should have pulled away. I should have said something, laughed it off, reminded myself of everything that was at stake. But I didn't. I let him hold it. And in that moment, I knew. I had already crossed the line. The first kiss wasn't planned. It wasn't a decision. It was a force. A pull. Something bigger than either of us. 1 second, we were staring at each other, breathless in the dim light. The next, his lips were on mine. Tentative at first. Testing. Waiting for me to stop him. I didn't. Then it deepened. His hands in my hair. Mine gripping the front of his shirt. A desperate, electric hunger I hadn't felt in years. The taste of him. The scent of his skin. The way he held me like he had been waiting for this moment as long as I had. And then reality. I pulled back first. My breathing ragged. My heart pounding so hard I could barely think. Guilt slammed into me like a tidal wave. I had kissed another man. I had let him touch me. I had wanted him to. What had I done? Jason searched my face. His eyes were dark, filled with something I wasn't ready to name. Sarah, I stood up too fast. My chair scraped against the floor. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of there before I did something I couldn't take back. But I already had. I stumbled outside, into the rain, my hands shaking as I fumbled for my keys. Jason followed me. Stopped me. He didn't say anything. Just looked at me, his face unreadable. I wanted to say something. Anything. But there were no words. I turned, got in my car, and drove away. My lips still tingled from his kiss. And all I could think was, I wanted more. The first time it happened, I told myself it was the last. I had sworn to myself, gripping the steering wheel that night in the rain, that I wouldn't let it go any further. That the kiss was a mistake, a moment of weakness, a crack in my judgment that could still be sealed before it split everything apart. But the next morning, when I woke up to a message from Jason, everything inside me crumbled. I can't stop thinking about last night. Neither could I. I should have ignored it. I should have blocked his number. I should have told him it was over before it even began. But instead, my fingers moved on their own. Me neither. And that was it. The moment I stopped fighting it, the affair didn't start with another kiss. It started with stolen moments. Late-night conversations that lasted hours, my heart racing with every message. Excuses to leave the house, grocery runs that took too long, last-minute errands, an old friend I had suddenly reconnected with. And then, finally, the first time. I had been telling myself it wasn't physical. That as long as we weren't touching, weren't crossing that invisible line, it wasn't real. That lie shattered the moment I stepped into his apartment. It wasn't planned. Or maybe it was. Maybe every message, every glance, every moment we had inched closer to this had been leading here all along. The door clicked shut behind me. Jason was there, standing inches away, watching me like he was memorizing every detail, afraid I might disappear. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice low, hesitant. I should have turned around. Walked away. Driven home to my husband, to my children, to the life I had spent years building. But I didn't. I nodded. And when he kissed me this time, I didn't pull away. That was the beginning. Once you cross a line like that, you don't go back. You tell yourself it's under control. That you'll be careful. That no one will know. But affairs don't stay hidden forever. At first, it was thrilling. The secrecy. The way Jason would brush past me in public, his fingers barely grazing my skin, sending shivers up my spine. The late-night meetings. The rushed goodbyes. The stolen hours that made my heart race with the kind of adrenaline I had forgotten existed. But the guilt. The guilt was suffocating. There were nights I would lie beside Mark, my body still burning from Jason's touch, and wonder how I had become this person. Mark would reach for me sometimes, half-heartedly, out of obligation rather than desire. And I would flinch. Not because I didn't want him, but because his touch no longer felt like mine to accept. I became someone else entirely. Lying came easier. Excuses rolled off my tongue before I even had time to think. And then came the night everything fell apart. I had been careless. Jason had come over. Just for a little while. Just to talk, I had told myself. Just to be in the same room, because being apart felt unbearable. We weren't careful enough. We didn't hear the front door open. We didn't hear the footsteps. But when I looked up, when I saw Mark standing there in the doorway, his face pale, his hands shaking, everything inside me shattered. Silence. Heavy, unbearable silence. Jason froze beside me. Mark's eyes flickered between us, taking in everything, the way I was sitting too close, the way Jason's hand had been on my knee, the way my entire body was screaming guilt. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet. How long? I couldn't answer. Because the truth would destroy him. Because the truth would destroy me. Mark's voice cracked. Sarah, how long? I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. And that silence? That silence was my answer. Mark didn't say anything else that night. He just turned and walked away. I sat there, frozen, my pulse thudding in my ears. Jason shifted beside me, exhaling sharply, running a hand through his hair. Sarah, I shook my head. I couldn't process anything. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Jason reached for my hand, but I pulled away. I have to go. I don't even remember walking upstairs. I don't remember opening the bedroom door. But I remember the silence. Mark was sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to me. I wanted to say something. To explain. To beg. But what was there to say? I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for him to look at me. To yell. To demand answers. But he didn't. He just laid down, turned his back, and pulled the covers over himself. And that silence? That was worse than any scream. The days after that were unbearable. Mark didn't speak to me. Didn't acknowledge me. He moved through the house like a ghost, avoiding eye contact, leaving the room whenever I entered. I thought I had known loneliness before. I was wrong. Loneliness was sitting across from someone you had once loved and knowing they would never look at you the same way again. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to explain. But he didn't want to hear it. The distance between us became something physical. He slept in the guest room. He barely ate. He barely existed in the same space as me. I told myself I had done this to us. That this was what I deserved. But then there was Jason. Jason, who texted me. Who called. Who told me everything would be okay. Jason, who wanted to see me. And when I was with him, the guilt disappeared. When I was in his arms, the world blurred, and I could pretend, for a little while, that nothing else mattered. But reality always came crashing back. Because Jason wasn't just an escape anymore. He was something else. Something bigger. Something I couldn't control. He wanted more. He wanted me to leave Mark. To stop hiding. To be his. And the worst part? A part of me wanted that too. But I wasn't ready. I wasn't sure if I would ever be ready. Because as much as I tried to run from it, there was a part of me that still belonged to the life I had built with Mark. A part of me that wasn't ready to burn it all down. And yet, I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. I told Jason that. I begged him not to stop. Because he was the only thing that still made me feel alive. And I knew. That stopping was the only thing that could save what was left of my family. But I wasn't ready to be saved. I barely recognized myself anymore. One night, I stood in front of the mirror, staring at the woman looking back at me. My reflection felt like a stranger. The hollow eyes, the tightness around my mouth. The way my shoulders curled inward like I was trying to disappear. Who have I become? I used to be sure of myself. I used to be a good wife. A good mother. A good person. But now? Now, I was living two lives. One where I was still Mark's wife, walking through the house like a ghost, waiting for him to speak to me, to look at me, to acknowledge that I still existed. And another where I belonged to Jason. Where I felt wanted. Where I felt alive. I had been replaying everything in my mind. Every choice. Every moment where I could have stopped this before it went too far. I could have ignored that first text. I could have said no to that first coffee. I could have pulled away from that first kiss. But I didn't. And now, I was standing in the wreckage of the choices I had made. The guilt was unbearable. It sat in my chest like a weight, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I had broken something that could never be fixed. Mark would never trust me again. Even if he stayed, even if we tried to rebuild, there would always be a crack running through the foundation of our marriage. And Jason. Jason was everything I had been craving. But he wasn't a safe place. He wasn't stability. He was fire. Passion. A love so consuming that it threatened to burn everything else down. I was standing at the edge of a cliff and I had two choices. Try to fix what I had broken. Or jump. Stay with Mark. Stay in the cold, empty house. Try to convince him that I was still worth loving. Or leave. Let Jason take my hand and pull me into something unknown. Something dangerous. I had never felt more lost. And then, the truth hit me. Loneliness had led me here. Not love. Not desire. Not some grand, faded romance. Just loneliness. Loneliness is a powerful thing. It makes monsters out of good people. It turns wives into strangers. It turns quiet pain into reckless decisions. I had spent so long feeling invisible that the second someone saw me, I ran toward them without thinking of the consequences. And now I had to live with them. I turned away from the mirror because I couldn't stand to look at myself anymore. I don't know how this story ends. Maybe Mark forgives me. Maybe he doesn't. Maybe I walk away from Jason. Maybe I don't. Maybe I spend the rest of my life regretting this. Or maybe, just maybe, I don't regret a single second of it. But here's what I do know. Once you cross the line, there's no turning back. You can apologize. You can try to fix what's broken. You can beg for forgiveness. But the past doesn't change. And betrayal? It doesn't just disappear. It lingers. It becomes a stain on everything you once thought was pure. So, I have to ask you, do you think love can survive betrayal? If you were in my shoes, if you had been drowning in loneliness, starving for affection, desperate to feel something again, would you have done the same? Or would you have been stronger than me? Tell me your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been trapped between desire and loyalty? Have you ever felt like the life you built was slipping through your fingers and you had no idea how to stop it? Because if you have, then maybe you understand. And if you don't, maybe you will one day. If you're feeling neglected, speak up before it's too late. Because silence is dangerous. And once you cross the line, there's no going back. For more shocking infidelity stories, subscribe to Shocking Infidelity Saga. You won't believe what's coming next.